Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar with Dr. Chris Brammer, physio. Chris is going to be talking through some exercises. I'll let him tell you what he's going to do. So I'm Helen Clitheroe. I'm a coach at the Leeds Hub and lead on Steeplechase for England Athletics. We've done quite a few webinars now. So if this is the first one that you've joined, you can go back and watch a few. We've had various guest athletes doing interviews and guests, physios, strength and conditioning experts, etc., going through all sorts of stuff. So there's loads of things that you can go back and watch as well if you haven't watched any so far. But welcome, and I will welcome Chris, and I will leave the screen so you can get on with the session. Thanks, Chris, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Oh, no worries. Thank you very much, Helen. So my name is Chris Brammer. I'm a physio, and I've worked in athletics for, the past nearly 8 years now. So working in track and field, my PhD is in running biomechanics. So for me, one of the things I'm really sort of passionate about is how we can optimize movement with people in order to sort of prevent injuries and improve our performance. So that's a big thing for me that I love to do with runners. And I run a few biomechanics clinics up in Manchester, which is where I'm based, over at the Manchester Institute of Health and Performance, where effectively we try to put them sort of mechanical principles into clinical outcomes for people. And I do this through my own company, which is called Extra Mile Health. So the session that I'm going to do today for you is a bit of a build on from what we did last year. So as Helen mentioned, if any of you didn't see the session that we talked about last year, you can log on to the England Athletics website and you can access it via the hub there. But what we talked about last time was all about best practice tips for injury prevention. And we talked about a range of different sort of topics. And what I wanted to use this session for was really to try and expand on some of those range of topics and give you guys some of the practical elements to go along with that. So what I want this session is to be interactive. So ideally, I want you all to get involved and follow on with me as I try and give you some little tips. Bits of equipment that you're possibly going to need if you're only just joining us are, first of all, we'd like a TheraBand, and second one would be a kettlebell. So we're going to use them. It's not a problem if you don't have them. You can do the same things body weight. It just works a little bit better if we have them additional resistance stuff. And I'm also going to give us some things that don't require them as well. So don't worry too much, but you definitely need some floor space. Now, I think last time I sort of touched on this about why do we want to prevent injury? And in a nutshell, this comes down to the fact that the more we can keep training, the greater the likelihood we are of being successful. And the steeplechase in particular is one of the events that has quite a high injury incidence, particularly because of the demands that the sport places on everybody. So what we want from best practice is to try and reduce those risks of you picking up injury either in competition or in training. Because what we know as a fact is that the more consistent we can be as athletes and the more of the training sessions we can hit week on, week out, the more likely we are to get to the summer and to be able to achieve the goals we want. And many studies have supported that. And in particular, this one that I quote there is the results that come from a study out of the Australian Institute of Sport, which basically say if people completed greater than 80% of their planned training workload, the odds of them achieving their summer goals increase by 7 times. So more training we can do, the better. So, I mean, that moves us on to really what we were trying to attain in terms of identifying what's a robust athlete. And a robust athlete is basically one who can cope with the training demands and the competition demands while having the ability of their chassis to prevent themselves from getting injured. And for me, where I think of how we make a robust athlete, it is quite complex. And it's about getting all the subtle little things right within your training. So for me, I am a big fan of simple things done well. I don't think we need to overcomplicate injury prevention, and I don't think we need to overcomplicate a lot of what we do in life. I'm a big believer that if we get all of these small I'm not even going to call them 1%ers, these 5%ers and 10%ers right, that this can all add up to us performing as at the standard that we want and being nice and robust and staying injury free. So fundamentally, what underpins performance, particularly at a steeplechase level, is going to be influenced by your skill and your technical qualities, i.e., can you clear that hurdle? Can you clear that barrier and that water jump? And can you land it without, compromising your movement patterns? And what's going to underpin your ability to even get yourself into that position to try and clear that barrier and maintain technical qualities is going to be influenced by both your physiological qualities and your physical qualities. So what we mean by physiological qualities is what is everything you're developing from a training perspective. That heart, that lung, those lungs, what we like to, or I like to refer to as ultimately the engine that we have inside our body. Whereas these physical qualities are what I refer to as the chassis. So for me, I always say to athletes, it's all well and good as having a Ferrari engine, but if the chassis is akin to an old beaten up Ford Fiesta, you're going to put your foot down because you can, but that chassis is then going to start to fall apart. So my role as a physiotherapist is to try and help people in terms of developing those physical qualities that make a robust chassis. So key areas for me are usually around mobility, stability, and strength. Now, obviously, in the last session, Dane talked to you a lot about strength. So what I'm going to try and focus on here or nail down on some of these practical skills for you guys is around the mobility and sort of stability element. So mobility for me is really important. And if you look at chase as a movement pattern and you look at clearing that barrier, you can see the ranges of movement that are placed upon the hip. It's quite a high demand in terms of those positions that you're going to have to get into. Now, if we don't have the mobility around our hip joints, that's going to have a knock-on effect in terms of how well you actually perform the task in terms of clearing the barrier. So what you can often see is people who can't get themselves into those positions will jump further up to try and sort of clear the barrier from a greater height rather than continuing to move forward, which inevitably is wasted energy. But also that loss of mobility around specific areas can have a knock-on effect to other areas. So I see a lot of people who, I'm a big fan of the hip complex, and I think the hip's a really important area. And I see a lot of people who, if they don't have optimal movement patterns around the hip and optimal strength around the hip, this has a knock-on effect to other segments, such as the back, such as the sacroiliac joint. And then it can even have an influence on what happens later down the line. So mobility for me is all about how we influence where your joints are, your movement patterns for both injury and performance perspectives. Now, the key thing for me to point out to you all here before we start doing specific hip mobility is that actually this is a very individual thing. So some of us might just naturally be a bit tighter than others, a bit more restricted. And the rest of us could be really mobile. So there's no one size fits all approach when it comes to mobility-based exercises or even strength-based exercises. These areas are unique to you. So you have to kind of find what works for you. And in order to do that, it requires the work of either your own intuitive knowledge of your own bodies, or working in collaboration with your coach and your physiotherapist to think, actually, these areas we sort of find time and time again. So what I'll show you today, I'm going to give you some tips and I'm going to get you to do some exercises around mobility for the hip. I want you all to follow on if possible, that would be great. So you can see what we do from a hip mobility perspective and find stuff that might be useful for you. Sometimes you've got to accept that an exercise might not be great. And if that's the case, you don't have to necessarily use it. But some of you others might find exercises that are really useful and therefore you think, I can integrate this into my sort of training.